Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine's Standing Committee on Solid Earth Geophysics webinar on tracking environmental changes due to COVID-19 through remote sensing. My name is Thorsten Becker. I'm the chair of the Standing Committee, and I'll be hosting this webinar together with my colleague, Cindy Ebinger. The Standing Committee for Seismology for Solid Earth Geophysics is a panel of the National Academy, and we are sponsored by agencies including the National Science Foundation, USGS, NASA, and DOE. And our objective is to foster conversation and to foster exchange in the solid earth sciences, to support research, to support the community in their efforts. And in this function, we conduct several meetings per year, usually in person, now of course virtually. We run webinar series, and we lead and we contribute to a number of reports and other activities. You can go to our webpage to learn more about the committee's activities. And today we are going to focus on the impact of COVID-19 as seen through remote sensing. If you could advance the slides. Before we get started, a reminder to our audience, which I would like to welcome. We have a large number of people online here, and we will have a chance to answer questions briefly after each of the presentations. And I encourage you to use the Q&A feature of this webinar. These questions will be moderated and will be answered by our panelists, and my colleagues in the Ebinger will be handling these questions. So please use the Q&A button. That is, I'd already mentioned that. Just a brief note on COSEG. Our sponsors, NSF, NASA, DOE, USGS. And I would like to encourage you to take a look at our website to learn more about the activities that we've supported throughout the years. Our goal is really to understand and encourage the review and exchange regarding all kinds of topics regarding Earth structure, dynamics, and its evolution. And we are seeking to support community discussion and community agency interactions, including with this webinar. So when we look at the impacts of COVID-19, it is clear that the geophysically and the earth science impacts go across the scales. And the last couple of months have seen huge changes in the environment in which we live. Those changes go across the scales. On the left here is an example from a recently published paper showing the change in the noise spectra measured by seismometers in northern Italy. On the right, we have a totally different data set. We have satellite observations illustrating before and after in terms of the tropospheric NO2 column. So we're dealing with atmospheric and solid earth responses that can be measured remotely, as nicely summarized recently in an EOS article by Duncombe. And it is these impacts that we would like to discuss today in our webinar, and more than just quantifying what has happened due to things like shutdowns and other things, we'd like to see if we can draw some insights from those changes, if we can learn something about the Earth that we didn't know before, and if we can perhaps draw conclusions in terms of future actions as researchers, but also as societies at large. We have a great list of speakers who will explore a number of aspects of these changes. And in order of their appearance, we are going to be hearing from Dr. Thomas Lecocq. He's a seismologist at the Royal Observatory of Belgium and teaches geophysics at the Free University of Brussels. He's interested in a range of phenomena in both tectonic and environmental seismology. And he's worked on geothermal areas, volcanoes, and faulting. And he's also very much interested in community-based approaches to science and open source software development. Our next speaker is Dr. Susan Anenberg. She's an associate professor of environmental and occupational health and of global health at the George Washington University Milken Institute School of Public Health. Dr. Anenberg studies the health implications of air pollution and climate change from local to global scales. Besides her academic pursuits, Dr. Anenberg is also involved in a range of science policy efforts on air quality and climate change, including in collaboration with the US Environmental Protection Agency, the World Bank, the World Health Organization, and the United Nations Environmental Program. Dr. Nate Lindsey is our third speaker, and he's currently the George Thompson Postdoctoral Fellow in Geophysics at Stanford University. His research is on new methods in fiber optic sensing. Those can have potential applications from local monitoring to offshore earthquake early warning. Recently, Dr. Lindsey has focused on the calibration of distributed acoustic sensing experiments and application of those in marine geophysics and urban ground motion. It's my great pleasure to act as host for this webinar here, and we're very excited to hear from our speakers, and I would like to hand it over to Dr. Lecocq for the first presentation.
Thank you, Thorsten. Share my screen and we can get started. Hi. So this is a very nice opportunity you're giving me here to talk in front of such a fantastic audience for the National Academy of Science. It's a great honor for me to be here this morning with you, and it's a late afternoon here in Brussels. So the message we want to convey here is that seismology is of course an old science, something that's more than 100-year-old, but we can learn new things with it if we look at our data closely. So this contribution I'm showing today is a contribution of many people who have been busy working with seismic noise and seismic data for a long time, but also some a little bit more recently, and sharing all together the passion for looking at data. What is, well, seismic monitoring in our case? In Belgium, we have a small country. You see the scale at the bottom, 50 kilometers compared to the US. Of course, it's very small place. But we have a dense seismic network, and depending on the geology where we put the stations, you see that they have more stations in the south, here in the south of the country, and less in the north, and that has an influence. That has been influenced, by the geological context. If you are in the south of the country, you're closer to the rock. If you're in the north of the country, you're on soft sediments, on sand, for example, and then the coupling was your seismometer is less good. So when we seismologists at the observatory, we want to install new stations, we search for good sites to be far away from cities as far as we can in rural areas. But then, of course, the country is small and the population density is high, so we are not very far from cities. On a global scale, you have different type of networks. You have, for example, a GSN, the Global Seismic Network, and you see all the triangles here on the world map are individual seismic stations of the Global Seismic Network that is installed since probably almost 100 years, but more recently the digital data has been available too. And then the ISC registry, which is an International Seismological Commission registry, which has the station book for all stations worldwide. You see that there's a lot of coverage of stations. There's places where there are few stations because of the remoteness mostly of the places. And at that time, when you wanted to have a seismic station, long time ago, it was not digital. You couldn't rely on solar panels, but you had to change, for example, a sheet of paper every 12 hours or every day. So of course, in the middle of the Sahara, it would be a bit more difficult. Some areas are densely populated and densely instrumented. And this is something that is also, if you look at what the world population map looks like, it looks similar to the map here at the bottom. There's also some networks called the Citizen Science Network. For example, the Raspberry Shake network has been deployed since a few years. So individual people, you and me, we can buy seismometers from this company, Raspberry Shake, and have a little computer for a little less than $1,000. And they're shipped worldwide. You install it in your internet connection, and then you're part of the big network. You see that again, these stations are even more linked to where people live because it's individuals buying this equipment. So you get this equipment in your house. So that's, you see a lot of stations that can record a lot of stuff. So what is the seismic noise we're interested in? Well, seismic noise is composed of different elements. And here in the middle, you have a spectrum from a station, seismic station, typical seismic station. And you see that we have discretized in 3 bands. So here in the red, it would be a high frequency, short period band. Here in the middle would be a higher noise level. So this spectrum here is higher and is mostly linked to the hum and the wave-wave interaction in the ocean, which generate a lot of pressure sources at the bottom of the ocean. And these pressure sources radiate in the solid earth as surface waves, and they travel all around the world in the crust. And they are measurable from any coastal station to any very far away station in the middle of Siberia, for example. And then at very long period, that is something we link to the gravity wave of the ocean. What we're interested in the topic today is mostly here the left part of the screen. And we have here, you see a very large spread of the amplitude of the noise. So it changes from very low noise to higher noise and can even go here to that limit, which has been defined in 1993 as the standard high noise level, noise model for the world. And this noise is influenced both by the wind, for example, that has a strong effect on buildings and instrumentation, and of course, a lot by the human activity. So another way to look at it is to look at the Belgian stations. So I'm from Belgium, so I show you what we have here. The first row is all stations from the Belgian network. The second row is the surface stations only, and the third one is the at-depth stations. So we also try to put the stations in a very quiet environment, for example, in caves, in boreholes, or in natural, in human-made galleries in hills to be less noisy environment. And you see that the effect is strong from an oil station or surface station to the borehole station. There's a 20 decibel difference, so it is a lot. It means that we already know that the noise is dropping when you go to depth, but we also know when we go far away from cities. So if we look at the seismic noise for 2 years, for all the Belgian stations. So here you have a station at the, in the east of the country. It is what one is at the shore. You see the surface stations, they pop up in brighter color. Brighter color means stronger noise levels. And these noise levels have been computed using, for example, here the 5 to 20 hertz band. So it's relatively high frequency. And this frequency is typical for the earthquakes we have here in the region. So small earthquakes of magnitude between 0 and 4, for example. So what we have here is something that is very difficult to look at. So what we do some magic coding and we obtain clock plots. These clock plots have 24 hours around the clock, and the amplitude of the seismic noise is represented here as a radially opening curve. And so these lines here have different colors, and each color corresponds to a day. So for example, if we look at this station here, OPT, and you see that the blue and all the following colors up to green and blue are similar, meaning the first 5 days of the week have high noise level, and the Saturday and Sunday are smaller. If you look at UCLE, UCC, it's the station that's actually behind me on the background screen, and I will show you a picture later of that place. It is basically in the middle of the city, well, it's not the middle of the city, but it was in the suburbs of Brussels city, but then it was of course caught up when the city expanded in the 20th century. So you see here that the blue and the green at night between 1 and 3, 4 in the morning are higher than the rest of the days. This is because Friday night, so Saturday morning, and Saturday night, Sunday morning, have higher activity, people going back from their parties. So we have all that in the data. So what can we say also when something different happens? So the Belgian COVID data, and for people who have been in Brussels, well, it looks like any major city in the world, of course. You have big roads, lots of cars during peak rush hours. And the right part of the picture is what it looked like on the 3rd day of lockdown on 20th of March here in Brussels. It was absolutely quiet in many senses, and I'm going to come back to the different ways of understanding quiet, but it was audibly quiet and seismically quiet. So what does it look like in seismology? Left is a normal day in February, and right is the plot from the 25th of March here of when that picture was taken. And you see that you have a feeling that this energy here is much larger than this one. But it's difficult to quantify, of course, like that. But it looks like at least twice or maybe 30% more. I don't know. So we want to look at those because we know we knew this was going to happen. When it snows in Brussels, everything stops, and we know the seismic nodes go down. We know it's lower at night. So okay, can we quantify that? So the seismic station is installed here in the basement of the pavilion that was constructed in 1900 to host the historical seismometers of the observatory. And so this seismometer, of course, you see here, it's a nice neighborhood. It's not the middle of the city, but it's close by. So what we had was this plot of like from January to now, well, and that's to March. And you see that the first lockdown measures occurred here, the black line, and was 18th of March. And the red one is the strictest lockdown. So everything closed, no essential movement is forbidden, only going to shops. And you see that from that point to that point, we lost 33% of seismic energy that was recorded by this instrument. And that those 33%, of course, is very small. It's a few nanometers that we measure. So we measure displacement of the ground. Where traditionally with seismometers we measure velocity, but to be more accessible for the public and the people we've wanted to share with, we said that in displacements because you can relate it, for example, to a hair strand, which is something like 0.1% of a hair strand. It's a very small difference, but still it's measurable. So with the time being, we try to put those things on Twitter and more to talk about it. And so you see here, for example, there was an increase of seismic noise, and I was at home and I was like, oh, come on, no, we have to stay home. This is April, May, it's not yet, lockdown is not over, we need to stay out. But then a colleague of mine sent us that just next to the seismometer, there was a beko flattening the house, completely destroying the house. And so, of course, you can also have very local influences on your seismometer, and that has to be taken into account. So, and now since early June, we are back to normal, or still close to normal in Brussels, at least in terms of what the seismometer is picking up. And if we look at the clock plots again, this is before the lockdown, and this is after the start, so during the lockdown. And you have here, you see that the daily levels are actually at the weekends level before. And so this is really an important thing. So my talk is also entitled something about the community. So we started to talk about this for a specific reason. Was first to show my colleagues and friends that our systems work and we can still use them. And thanks to all the infrastructure and the IT people and engineers who bring back the data. But also to show other citizens, people from Brussels and Belgium, that if we all do the effort, we can keep the seismic noise low, and maybe we can keep the virus away. And so these tweets was this. So you have the official tweet from the Seismology. That's okay, I do it, and then you have my personal tweet when I say that the virus won't stop the noise, but at least it will lower the anthropogenic contribution of it. And because I like to share stuff and codes, for example, we immediately set up a GitHub repository with the code to generate those figures, and those tweets and the following things occurred in a flash in a few days afterwards. Certainly when Gizmodo took over and started to talk about all this stuff, the story went a bit viral without bad wording, and we had a lot of visibility in the media, and some actually were very much into the human effects and not only on a seismological point of view. We measure a difference in velocity of the ground motion or displacement of the ground motion, but what we certainly measure is the effort that all together we make, and all together we do change the seismic environment. So what if we could do this effort for other causes? That was the question we raised in those papers. So this community, so we shared a Google form and the seismic and the code. And some people just picked it up. For example, Mark Van Stone, he is a teacher at school in Cornwall in the UK, and he applied all the codes to make posters for this seismometer. So this little Raspberry Shake, so this citizen seismometer that he has at school, and he's showing different aspects of the seismic noise to teach the pupils and the public about what happens when you look at the data that you record with your non-professional instrument in the school. Frédéric Massin from the ETH also helped shaping the code so that we can share it with even more people. And then we gathered all the people who subscribed on Slack, on the Google form with us. And so as of today, we are at 102 people have joined the Slack discussion. So we created this lockdown seismology. We could have also called it the Seismologists at Home group. So it's a lot of people from probably more than 30 countries discussing what we observe and kind of organizing the work that we want to also to publish and to make available for others. You see that at the bottom that we are today at 8.7 thousand messages since April 1st, with a joke. So that's actually a very nice effort. And I think the first thing that came out of that community was this paper published in National Geographic by a journalist who contacted me, and she asked me, do you have, I see that you have a big group, so you can provide me data from many places in the world. And I told her, okay, just contact this and that person, and then you'll get the data. And this is one of the effects of this community we built here. And so we have people from Italy who provided Milan data, from Los Angeles, Brussels, Barcelona, Nepal, and New York, for example, but we also had other people. And so this was the first collaborative work. And I also thank to the journalist, she was very running after people to get the data, but it worked. And so these are a few examples of what people have provided. So Dave Cornwall, for example, computed the seismic noise reduction in Brooklyn, and you see that the before and after might not seem significant, but in such a busy place as Brooklyn, you see that the noise level is still going down. That's Celeste Labette. She did the computation for Los Angeles, and you see really this strong drop here. And that image, for example, was stopped on May 17. But of course, you can continue doing that because the continuous data of seismic networks allow to do that. An example from Orono, from Berkeley, when you have also this drop, you see that there are a few events there also, that there are a few different things, maybe not necessarily the same Beko as we have in Brussels, but can be that. That's the latest, that's published yesterday, I think, from Alan Kafka. He continues publishing with Jay Pulley. They publish a lot of information on Twitter for those who want to follow him. So this is a seismograph that's in the Boston area, and they compare it with the mobility, the information that you can extract from either Apple Mobility or Google or City Mappers or stuff like that. So all the big brothers that survey and monitor what your phone is doing, they also released a bunch of mobility information that we can correlate with the seismic data we observe. You see that the correlation is not one-to-one, but there is something in the data that says that what we measure, of course, is linked to humans. We know it because we have the day to night and weekdays and weeknights and weekends difference. But there is for sure, there is a contribution from vehicles moving, trains, trams, people running. Maybe if you have a marathon next to your seismometer, you see it too. Maybe not a single pedestrian, but that's, I think Nate might talk about the sensitivity of the different things we are looking at. We have the examples from Barcelona, from Costa Rica. And then what I wanted to show you is that this community is also in 12 time zones, which is quite helpful when you want to organize something like a special issue in the EGU publication. So we wanted to have a special publication on the social seismology, we called it, and to gather papers, gather all the efforts that our community has been creating, and also being inclusive with other people who have not been in the first 100. We are very open, of course, for new contributions on different aspects, including the performance increase, because if the seismic noise go down, your seismic network might be better in measuring earthquakes, for example, because you have less noise, so your signal to noise ratio would be better. And we also gather a special session at the EGU full meeting, which will happen most probably virtually. In Brussels, we are studying the seismic noise with an array, but also with a microphone, because we know there is a link between the two. So we want to look at the physical properties of this noise. And so we also want to link, this initiative was called the Quiet Project, based in the UK, recording sounds of quietness around the world. And we want to group that with seismic observations so that we can link the physical what's happening in the atmosphere and in the ground. And that's an example of the noise level in Brussels for one day. You see that it goes up, and then these results are just from a few days ago. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name's Cindy Ebinger. I'm at Tulane University, and I'll be taking some of your questions. At this moment, we have a general question to all of the speakers that we'll bring up at the end of the talk. But I think one of my questions to Thomas is this community of scientists who are sharing software. You've been very generous in posting software help and encouraging others to then post and share information. How is that changing the way that we're doing science?
Well, it's really overwhelming. It is something really, well, I can't think of a better word than crazy. I think with this thing since 2 or 3 months now, we've been and very busy scientifically and very busy also in terms of emotionally. It's interesting because it's a special period for everyone being home, and while being at home, we just passed around manuscripts and figures and codes between people in different time zones. So actually it was virtually going all around the world in continuous motion. So even though I went to bed, someone in Mexico would take over and then continue developing the code. So the way we work as a global community is not new, but for this thing, we were really everywhere in the world. So that was really amazing. And for sure, seismology has a long history of sharing. I mean, you could go since forever in an observatory and get the seismic data. You could get the sheet of paper. Since the onset of internet, seismology has been always at the forefront of sharing data and being open. I mean, the GSN network and all these worldwide networks have always have the open data way of life, of sharing. But then indeed, the modern way of being able to share easy code and reproducible codes thanks to very, very good libraries. For example, we use a lot of Python codes, and those libraries that were available, like OpsPy and the plotting libraries, Matplotlib, allow any person to reproduce the codes. Even people who have never used Python were able to do it. So that's very, very positive things in our mind, that we can just share a working solution that is easy to adapt for people.
Great, and another question that's come from outside is about new signals. With the quiet time periods, have we been better able to detect and understand some some natural signals, or are there new signals as well that you discovered?
Yeah, so there's not, to my knowledge, not yet anything published on that, but we've been discussing, of course. And one example is there was a magnitude 4 event, a bit larger in northern Sweden, that was measured by all seismic networks in Europe during lockdown. And it was not such a big event in terms of, I mean, big for Sweden for sure, but not for the rest of the world. But then, for example, in Brussels, the signal was fantastic. So it means that for anyone looking at those events for a certain distance, that includes also what happens in the crust and in the mantle of the Earth, our station could be useful, which in normal terms is not. So there's things like that, and there's also, for example, in volcanic areas or in specific context, for example, Mammoth Mountain, Takarakitara in Berkeley, showed that there are small events that he could only record during the night due to the big machinery of the resort being like ski lifts and stuff like that. And know that they are stopped. Of course, you can record them all day long. So there's kind of like your completeness of your catalogs have an impact on that.
So a final question that just came in before we move to the next speaker is a general one about these low-cost sensors, the Raspberry Pis. Yep. Clearly, they don't cover a large bandwidth, but you know, how do they compare in terms of professional ones? And can you give some help to those listening to the talk who are unfamiliar?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's the different types of Raspberry Shakes, but the ones that are the most sensitive ones, so the ones based on geophones, are the most sensitive ones. And in a short period band, so between like 1 hertz and 100 hertz, they are reasonably good seismometers. They have a nice amplification and they record properly the ground motion. Of course, they're not seismometers, so they don't have the sensitivity of the seismometer. They have a strong gain, but they are good instruments in that frequency band, and they can record, for example, small local microseismicity. So if you live close to a fault or to a volcano, you might pick it up with a Raspberry Pi geophone from Raspberry Shake. The accelerometers that they sell is not suitable because it's too noisy. So you need really much stronger effects to measure that. Of course, for different kinds of like the Raspberry Shakes, I've also been showed to be used for the teleseismic events. So you want to look at seismic events in Japan when you're in Europe or in the US. That also works, but then it all involves a bit of filtering, and for sure you need that your Raspberry Shake is not next to your washing machine, for example. But they are reasonably good. I mean, comparison of one to one if they are in a quiet environment, on a pier, or in a borehole, they show at high frequency, they show very similar behavior as seismometers. Of course, there's differences and reliability and so on, but in general, they should be considered as good instruments for those aspects.
Thank you so much, Thomas.
It's been a pleasure.
We're going to move on now to Susan Anenberg, who is being introduced earlier.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. It's always hard to do two things at once. Okay, great. So I'm Susan Anenberg from the George Washington University. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you so much for your participation and attendance at this meeting. I'm going to be talking today about air quality aspects of environmental impacts of COVID-19 lockdowns. And in particular, a really interesting effect that we've noticed, which is that we're seeing inconsistent effects of COVID-19 lockdowns on nitrogen dioxide pollution in cities worldwide. And some of the work that we've been doing is trying to understand why are we seeing these inconsistent effects? Why is NO2 going down in some locations and less so in other locations? First, I want to say that almost all of this work has been led by Dr. Dan Goldberg from George Washington University, who is on parental leave right now. So I am stepping in for him, but just want to give my thanks and appreciation to Dan, and also the others listed here, and also our support from NASA through their Health and Air Quality Program, as well as their Rapid Response opportunity. So I know I'm in an audience that may not be sort of a usual suspect for talking about air pollution. So let me start with a little bit of background. Air pollution is considered the 5th leading global health risk factor for premature mortality. That is not the 5th environmental risk factor. That is the 5th overall leading risk factor affecting global mortality. So this is after things like dietary risks, high blood pressure, and tobacco. The largest contributing factor to the total air pollution burden is outdoor fine particulate matter, or PM2.5, followed by household air pollution. That's the continued use of solid fuels, burning of solid fuels and other polluting fuels inside people's homes for cooking and heating and lighting, mostly in developing countries. And then finally, ambient ozone pollution as well. And I will say that even though this seems rather high, the 5th leading overall global health risk factor being air pollution, this is, I would argue, pretty dramatically underestimated because we're not considering all the other air pollutants that we know also affect human health, and also additional health outcomes that are affected by these pollutants. So we still have a ways to go in terms of more comprehensively accounting for the health damages of air pollution in burden of disease assessment. Some of you may be familiar with this graph that is frequently shown by the EPA in their EPA 2019 Trends Report, just showing the dramatic decline in air pollution levels since the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments. And in fact, this has been a trend that has been ongoing since the 1970 Clean Air Act, but we don't have as extensive of monitoring networks going all the way back that far. But you can see that, for example, PM2.5 in the dark green line has dropped dramatically. And the dashed line here is the percent above or below the national ambient air quality standards, so that our national standards setting limits for air pollutants. We still struggle in the United States with ozone that's in the lighter green colors. And then I'll just say that nitrogen dioxide is in the darker kind of purplish color at the bottom there, showing that NO2 pollution is quite a bit below the current national ambient air quality standard, this is all good news, but there's a big caveat here that our national ambient air quality standards are often too high. So they're too, they're too loose to actually be adequately protecting public health. And that is the case for PM2.5, for ozone, and actually for NO2 as well. So even though these lines are trending below the national ambient air quality standards, they do not mean that we are breathing safe air here in the United States. So how does this relate to COVID-19? There's a few ways that air pollution interacts with COVID-19. First is that air pollution exposure may actually contribute to COVID-19 spread. So we have evidence from past pandemics and, just the typical flu and bacterial organisms, that these organisms can actually associate with particles in the air and spread pretty widely. So air pollution can actually contribute to COVID-19 spread. That we don't have very much evidence to show that that's occurring, but it is hypothesized as a possibility. A second interaction is that air pollution exposure may contribute to COVID-19 severity, and that might be using indicators like COVID-19 hospitalizations and deaths. There's been quite a bit written about this in preprints and in the mainstream media, but not a whole lot of causal evidence linking air pollution to COVID-19 severity quite yet. And then finally, physical distancing can affect air pollution levels, and that is going to be the subject of what I talk about today, because we can actually use satellites to observe these signals to show how this dramatic change in human behavior has affected air pollution levels all around the world. Understanding these relationships is really important, because if we know that air pollution exposure is a risk factor for COVID-19 severity, or contributes to the spread of COVID-19, then mitigating air pollution can be part of the public health response to COVID-19. Also, if we can understand the effect of physical distancing on air pollution levels, and understanding questions like why are we seeing different drops in air pollution in different locations, then this new understanding can help us design more effective and efficient environmental policies in the long term. And then finally, we know that both air pollution and COVID-19 appear to be affecting minority populations more severely. And so understanding these relationships can also help us design approaches for improving health equity. So I'm going to focus on nitrogen dioxide, or NO2. Why do we care about NO2? First of all, we have seen early results that air pollution contributes to COVID-19 severity, and NO2 is one of the pollutants that has been implicated in some preprints to date, and some peer-reviewed journal articles to date as well. NO2 is a tracer for urban traffic. It is mostly an anthropogenic pollutant. It doesn't have many natural sources, and it is a highly urban pollutant. As you can see in the map on the right, using the tropomi sensor for NO2 columns at about 1 kilometer resolution, you can see that NO2 is really mostly concentrated in urban areas. And of course, urban traffic is the emission source that has been mostly affected by the lockdowns. So it makes it a convenient pollutant to try to observe this signal of the lockdowns. NOx emissions, nitrogen oxide emissions, which create NO2, are also precursors to PM2.5 and ozone, the pollutants that I talked about previously that are linked with premature mortality. So if we can understand how NOx emissions are changing, we can also try to understand PM2.5 formation and ozone formation in the atmosphere. And then NO2 is associated with health effects, not just through PM2.5 and ozone, but actually direct exposure to NO2, or at least the broader traffic mixture of which NO2 is a marker, is associated with pediatric asthma incidents. These are new cases of asthma among kids. So there's many reasons to be studying NO2. It's also quite a convenient pollutant to be studying, because space-based NO2 columns are also highly correlated with ground level concentrations. And that's not something that we can say, for example, for PM2.5. So it makes it a little bit easier to try to tease out the signal of the lockdown effect. So I just wanted to show how important this pollutant is, because it's not currently included in the Global Burden of Disease study, although we're working with them to include it right now. NO2 contributes dramatically to pediatric asthma incidence in cities all over the world. So this is the 125 most populated cities of the world. And we can see that the percent of new asthma cases among kids that is attributable to NO2 pollution ranges all the way up to almost 50%, and that's in Shanghai. So what this means is that in Shanghai, about half of new cases of asthma among kids would not be occurring were it not for NO2 pollution. So these are preventable cases of asthma, and if we understand the formation of these pollutants and where they come from, we can try to avoid those kids who are affected by asthma. So OMI and TROPE-OMI, these are satellite sensors that capture NO2 changes, and we saw some pretty incredible images coming out from NASA and the European Space Agency, as well as others. This is on the top left is the impact of the lockdown in China on NO2 concentrations. If you just compare January on the left to February on the right, just really dramatic drops. Same for the top right figure, which we saw earlier already. This is showing the comparison of 2019 to 2020 in Europe, and again, very large drops. And then on the bottom there is the Northeast US, and that's comparing a 5-year average on the left to March 2020. And it turns out these averaging periods are quite important for reasons that I'm going to get to. But simultaneously with the images coming out from NASA and European Space Agency and some of these new, really rapid science that was done by people all over the world, there was quite a bit of attention given to this in the media. So here's just a couple examples. This is Bloomberg News showing, the drop of NO2 concentrations in various cities. Actually, I think that's PM2.5 right there. Here on the right is looking in India. If you compare before and after, how far can people see? And people were really, you saw images of people seeing the Himalayas or the Los Angeles cityscape for the first time in decades. And so there was a lot of attention being given to this. But at the same time, there was also reports coming out, and this was actually one that I contributed to, that air pollution was not dropping in all cities. So here's in DC, we were doing some preliminary analyses and showing that actually air pollution wasn't that much lower in DC during our lockdown period compared with this time of year in past years. And so we wanted to understand, why are we seeing these inconsistent effects? So here's some of our initial results, just looking at 3 U.S. cities, New York City, Washington, D.C., and Los Angeles. This was back in March when we were really, it was actually Dan Goldberg was spending some time using the TROPE-OMI NO2 sensor and trying to figure out, how was NO2 changing in various cities around the world. And so you can see here in Los Angeles, there was much more dramatic drops in nitrogen dioxide than in New York City. Washington was kind of in between, although you can see that it didn't really drop immediately after the lockdowns and then just started dropping really precipitously thereafter. And it turns out that this was actually an analysis that Dan had been doing. It was quite timely, but he had been doing this right before COVID happened, showing just the seasonal variation, these natural influences on TROPE-OMI NO2 from the change in the seasons during the year and meteorological effects. So on the left here is just showing the variation of column NO2 concentrations in 7 U.S. cities in different months of the year. And you can see this is really wintertime pollutant. So NO2 is highest in the winter months. During the time that lockdowns were occurring from mid-March to May and June, NO2 is just dropping naturally due to the seasonal change. So that was happening concurrently with the lockdown. We also know that there's meteorological influences on column NO2. So this is just showing wind speed here, but it's not just wind speed, of course, it's also wind direction and temperature and humidity and others. But just as an example, you can see faster wind speeds, NO2 is much lower. Again, this is independent of COVID. This was already happening looking at 2019 data from Tropomi. And so we can see, there are these really important natural influences on Tropomi NO2. It was really important to try to understand what the influence of these natural effects are because, like I said, the lockdowns were occurring concurrently with the seasonal change. And, much of the U.S. was experiencing really wet and windy weather during this period as well. And that keeps pollution low just naturally, even without any change in emissions. So we tried to come up with a few approaches to disentangle the effects of meteorology and emissions. So we compared method 0, which is our reference case, and that's just comparing January and February to March and April 2020. That doesn't account for the change in seasons, and it doesn't account for meteorology. It's just saying, what is that difference in NO2 from the early part of the year to the springtime? Then we came up with an approach to account for the seasonal change, and this is not, is not a novel approach that we came up with. Many others in the field were doing something similar. But here we're just comparing the same month in 2019 versus 2020. So if you compare mid-March to end of April in 2019 to the same month in 2020, you're accounting for that seasonal effect. And now you're starting to disentangle the effect of the seasonal change with the emissions. But then you also have the influence of meteorology. So we came up with two approaches, which are method 2 and method 3 here, to account for both the seasonal change and the daily meteorological variation. So Dan came up with an approach to normalize daily Tropomi NO2 observations by meteorology. So to do this, he created a sort of a typical day and scaled each day's NO2 column according to the meteorology that was occurring on that sort of typical day, typical temperature, typical wind speed. And then he compared those normalized results for 2019 versus 2020. The third approach is to account for both season and meteorology in a different way. So here we took advantage of a chemical transport model that was already running. It's the operational forecasting model from Environment and Climate Change Canada. And this model was already running continuously to predict the next 5 days of air pollution. So with this approach, we were simulating normal time. So the model doesn't know that COVID-19 is happening. It's just kind of simulating what would happen in normal time. And then if we compare the simulated Tropomi NO2 columns to observations, we can isolate the influence of COVID-19 lockdowns. So here's just a snapshot of the results from each of these three approaches. So for approach 1, again, this is the one where we account for the seasonal change, but not the daily meteorological variation. So here we're just comparing the same month in 2020 versus 2019. And on the left, we have the absolute difference. On the right is the ratio. And anywhere where there's blue, that means that 2020 is lower than 2019. So you can see quite a bit of blue throughout, especially in the most populated cities of the country where lockdowns had the biggest impact. Approach 3, again, was to normalize Tropomi NO2 columns by sort of typical meteorology. And when we do this, we hope to see sort of flat lines here. So the flat line would basically remove the influence of daily meteorology. And it worked somewhat in some locations. It worked better in some locations than in other locations. But this is just showing 3 examples here. And again, we saw larger declines in Los Angeles than we did in New York City and Washington, D.C. using this approach. And then we tried our last approach, which was to compare the simulated NO2 columns under normal times with the Tropomi observations during COVID-19 lockdowns. So the simulated normal times are the green lines here. The COVID-19 lockdowns that are observed are the blue lines. And again, we saw a larger difference in Los Angeles than we did in New York City and Washington, D.C. And you can see that even the green line with the simulated normal, this is declining throughout this period here. And that's expected, again, due to that seasonal change. So when we put this all together, we can compare 20 North American cities. And here we are showing the effect of the method 0, the reference case, in the black dots. And you can see that using just the 20 city average, which I've boxed here in the red, the change in NO2 columns was about a 40% decline, not accounting for the seasonal change or meteorology. When we account for seasonal change and meteorology shown in the green and blue dots, that decline in NO2 drops to about 20%. So much lower declines in NO2 when we account for these natural influences. So just to conclude, physical distancing we saw led to substantial NO2 drops in urban areas, and that was aided in some locations by very favorable meteorology, which kept air pollution low regardless of the emission changes. But there are some large remaining unknowns. We're now working, and many others in the field are also doing this, but working on understanding the factors that are driving these inconsistencies between NOx emission drops between locations. And then we did not see, I've only focused on NO2. We have not looked in our group at PM2.5 and ozone, but many others are. And finding that actually there's increases in PM2.5 and ozone in some locations, even when NOx emissions are declining rapidly. And these are very location specific, and they're driven by emissions changes in meteorology and atmospheric chemistry. And just one example of this is a paper that was published in Science a couple weeks ago showing that PM2.5 increased in China during this period of large NOx emission reductions. I just wanted to mention we have a couple preprints available. Again, Dan Goldberg is the lead author on both of these. So I think we'll make these slides available so you can find these links. And just to point you to a couple other really great resources, NASA has created a web page for nitrogen dioxide monitoring, which allows you to click on any of these cities. And if you click on a dot here, you get a really nice trend line of space-based NO2 observations and how they're changing. And then on the right is a collaboration between NASA, the European Space Agency, and others, showing an EO dashboard, a dashboard for environmental effects during COVID-19. So I will stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan, for a really interesting talk. There are several questions, and we can see where we are at the end, but I'd just like to quickly ask if you could provide some links in the questions here to additional papers linking the NO2 to asthma as a cause. It's a little bit beyond what we've just presented, but a few of the listeners are interested in that, so it'd be helpful. The second question, one of the listeners would like to know about Southern Hemisphere cities, say Buenos Aires or New Zealand or Australia, where seasonal differences should be and opposed by comparing the impact of the lockdown. Did you see differences there, or did you have?
First of all, of course, I'll post some links. Happy to do that. And secondly, great question about the Southern Hemisphere cities. We actually haven't dug into them yet ourselves. We've actually been focusing on differences between U.S., Europe, and China, where we know that the emissions makeup is different due to different rates of dieselization in the passenger vehicle fleet, since diesels release much more NO2 NOx emissions compared with gasoline vehicles. So just understanding those comparisons will help us understand the contribution of light-duty passenger cars to urban NO2 levels. But certainly in the Southern Hemisphere, that's something that we'll be looking at over the next few months. And they are included in that NASA website that I put up there. So you should be able to just go to that website and click on some of those cities, and you'll be able to see the trend lines.
Super. For this, I'm just looking to see. Okay. Is there any evidence from satellite data in the surface radiation budget? Long wave and short wave radiation and reduced aerosol, airplane, contrail, cloud forcings. It's probably
so it's a little bit,
yeah,
it's a little bit beyond what we were studying here, but there's definitely others that are looking into these aspects. So I will also try to dig up a couple preprints that I know about and put some links there too.
Super. There are some questions that are better suited for the end and for all panelists that we'll move to. So I think it's best that we move to the last speaker and then have the time for these broader questions. So I'd like to introduce the last speaker, Lindsey from Stanford.
Thanks, Cindy. It's an honor to be here today. Let me just share my slides. Okay, so you should be able to see this first slide. So thanks to the organizers, the National Academies, for having me today. And this talk is really focused on an emerging tool called distributed acoustic sensing, which is a fiber optic sensing method. And this talk is going to be a bit of an epilogue to Tomas's talk at the beginning. So it's interesting to see this kind of bookended around a talk that was a very cool talk about changes in air emissions due to COVID-19 and all these impacts. But my team at Stanford has been recording some measurements of a fiber optic array. And so to kind of motivate that, I thought I'd begin where Thomas kind of left off, which is looking at this amazing number of observations globally in terms of the marked change that we can see in seismic noise levels in cities around the world. And this huge effort by collaborators kind of internationally is staggering and a really interesting opportunity. I had a chance to be a part of this, and it was just so fun to be interacting with scientists during such a time of restriction. But I think the kind of ability of us to look at this problem globally begs the question of where this noise is actually coming from. And so that'll be the focus of this talk today, is what exactly is quieting. So when we look at seismic arrays, the focus here is not just to record at one location, the ground motion, but instead to record at thousands of locations spread across a dense area. Like, for example, here showing the Long Beach array, the opportunity was to look at vehicle patterns at the spacing of 100 meters, and you can see when you densify, when you add so many sensors, not just one in Long Beach, but 2,500 in this area of East Long Beach, you can actually see the 405 freeway, and the patterns it's basically the ground amplitude fall off from the freeway itself that you're seeing. The kind of source of this seismic noise is dominantly the freeway in this band around 4 hertz. And so this is kind of quite remarkable, right? Then you could measure changes in this 405 freeway over time, but you need an incredible number of things to go right to be able to do this type of array seismology. So to be able to localize the sources, in this case, the sensors that were deployed, it took an entire crew of individuals, days to be able to put out these sensors, swap the batteries and data cards, and to be able to facilitate this experiment for even a period of a few months took a large investment and a lot of people's time. And so to continuously run this for years would be logistically problematic. So this study is kind of motivates this question of what if we could use, what could we use instead to be able to monitor cities? So the cities it turns out, have an incredible amount of fiber. So there's this, these maps are just hilariously complicated, and that's partly because of the telecommunications industry and how it's been layered one on top of another over time. But these kind of maps show that there's a high correlation between rails and roads in the US, for example, and fiber pathways. So where fiber has been laid to connect different cities, there's wherever you see one of these little orange cones with the white base is a fiber optic cable buried beneath that section of the road. The same goes for Europe, and I put this map up because I think the point is that the nodes are the cities, right? So while the fiber is kind of densely covering a lot of the region of Europe here, in the cities, it's incredibly dense. And to kind of underscore that, there's is approximately 5.5 gigameters. So that would be a billion meters of fiber laid by just one company, CenturyLink, and they're adding about 2 gigameters predominantly in cities is where they're putting this fiber. So that's enough fiber to go across the US a few hundred times. So just for context. And a lot of times in cities, there are not just one, but many overlapping internet service providers like this one that are covering every block. So they're basically just layering this fiber on top of existing fiber. So this begs the question, if we could use this for geophysics, this fiber network, what would that allow us to then be able to monitor in terms of turning cities into kind of digital networks that we could be used for monitoring? So the way that we do this is a technique called distributed acoustic sensing. So this method works by essentially sending laser pulses into a fiber optic cable from one end. So not adding anything to the sensor itself. We're essentially using the scattering principles of the fiber to make measurements with an optical interferometry to measure the strain along this cable. And the details of that are described in this paper here if you're interested. But the basics of the measurement allow us to basically make measurements of the change in optical phase of light returning from a segment of the fiber. And by sending in a pulse and measuring the light returning from every segment of a fiber up to tens of kilometers away, the kind of length that we're sampling is about 10 meters, and we can do that over about 30 kilometers of fiber. By doing this at a very fast rate, we can sample any pulse in many thousands of hertz kind of range, and then discretize the cable into a fiber optic array. So that's how we kind of measure strain in the axis of the cable as a function of distance, of position x. And then we do that, we repeat the laser experiment, right? So we send in another pulse and we measure thousands of pulses per second to resolve the strain at kind of the seismic timescale. And those changes in optical phase, I didn't say this, but the change in optical phase is proportional to the strain. So that conversion is based on the gauge length of 10 meters, so that's fixed, and optical properties of the laser and the glass that we're using for the fiber. So this recent technique of kind of developed of DAS has been applied in a couple of really interesting areas just in the last year. So I thought I'd highlight a couple of them. First, in the footstep detection that's been going on in Penn State and Virginia Tech, some of my colleagues have been looking at this kind of data set. So this is looking at a few hundred channels along a fiber optic cable for a period of just 3 minutes on the x-axis. And so every position here is a separate channel of the fiber optic array data set. And you can see that when people got off a bus here near Penn State and began walking, you see that this group of people were all kind of moving down at 1 to 2 meters per second. And at the same time, one of the students in this party began kind of waited and then began walking later. And you can actually see this kind of interaction with another student walking or another person walking in the other direction. So this is kind of an amazing resolution that's allowed. And this is all kind of in this range of seismic vibration that Tomas was talking about earlier. So this is a really interesting application. There's another kind of area of this in terms of vehicles, right? So vehicles make even more noise than people. So this is from the Caltech group, Zhangwen Zhan and colleagues, looking at the Rose Parade right downtown Pasadena, California, and showing kind of the motorcycles moving out and back up the parade as you kind of envision what a parade looks like back when we could have parades. And you can also see the floats and bands kind of marching up the street. Now, the interesting thing about this is if you look at the frequency content, so the distribution of this kind of seismic noise in terms of the wavelengths that are actually being recorded, we have motorcycles are kind of at a higher frequency from kind of a half hertz to tens of hertz. And these floats tend to have much longer period energy. So we say lower frequency. So down towards 1 to 10 seconds, these floats. And you can actually see that in the single waveform, right? So it's this energy, this longer period energy that we're going to make use of. But this is really to say that this DAS recording over just a few minutes of recording shown here in kind of time frequency space represents a really broadband recording, right? So 3 decades here represented. So that's different than what a geophone would record, which is just a short period sensor. It might just capture some energy in this band. We're really being able to also look at these longer periods. So at Stanford in Palo Alto, California, here in the South Bay of the San Francisco Bay Area in California, we have a fiber optic cable basically laid from Stanford University to the Stanford Linear Accelerator near 280. And this cable is called the dark fiber. So it's unused for telecommunications. It's not being used for the internet. So we can kind of piggyback and use that for geophysics. So we hooked up one type of DAS, an ODH3, manufactured by a company called OptaSense, from one end in Stanford University, and turned this fiber optic cable into 1,250 independent channels, each measuring the ground motion, the horizontal direction in the direction of the fiber. The channel spacing between those channels was about 8 meters, and we're kind of subject to a spatial resolution of that gauge length of 20 meters in this case. And remember, we're sampling that cable thousands of times per second with laser. And then we're gonna basically subsample that very high rate interferometry signal at 250 samples per second. So this still leads to a massive amount of data. It's still recording, and it records about 100 gigs of data per day at all of these channels. So if you look at, this is the hope is to be able to use this to basically see, in this case, the change in traffic, right? So if you look at just one data set from one period of about 5 minutes of recording along 6 kilometers of this length, you can see that the noise, the kind of background signal is quite variable between different sections of the array. So any one column in this case is a position along this fiber optic cable measuring the horizontal strain. And you can see different vehicles moving out here at a given speed. You can actually see in this case, this vehicle kind of moving along the road and then slowing down and then speeding back up again. So this kind of pattern allows us to really carefully interrogate different sections of this array for the number of vehicles passing any one position. Now you can see that there are sections that are really misleading. So for example, this section is, I'm plotting this in terms of linear fiber length. So that's not necessarily linear position along the road, but cables do kind of oftentimes have linear paths along roads, but then they might sit inside of a termination cable splice box and then kind of make many turns where they're not moving and then go out in a different direction along a road. So in the case of Stanford, we have this kind of section, just zooming in on that previous figure, where Sand Hill Road actually is quite busy and trafficy. And the fiber then turns and goes towards Stanford Hospital. And it's much less busy back here on Stanford Hospital. So this energy is between 3 and 30 hertz, and that's kind of a higher frequency band. But if you look at the longer period energy, which we showed we have kind of record of, you see this, you see kind of vehicle tracks. And this is much more easily to interpret, right? I've actually numbered the vehicles that I can kind of interpret here. And you can see that the cars that are traveling southbound, that is from kind of lower numbers to higher numbers in time, are actually much higher amplitude. And that's because the fiber is buried on the southbound side of the road. Whereas the northbound passes are much less lower amplitude. The kind of model for what we're actually looking at here is not a seismic phenomenon, but actually a geodetic phenomenon. So this is a picture of a fiber buried kind of in a rail bed, attached to a rail bed, and changes on the order of tens of nanometers are what we're actually looking at when we look at this kind of static deformation, substatic deformation through time. So the reason that we're able to record kind of this signal down here in this range of period is because DAS has sensitivity down here where kind of those nodes that we're looking at in Long Beach would fall off in sensitivity. So again, just looking at this for a second, we can actually model a piece of this signal. So any one channel here shown in gray, you can see that there's 3 vehicles here at these locations. And taking a Boussinesq approximation for how the force converts to a horizontal strain, we can actually, with basic understanding of the distance from the road tire to the location of the fiber, and some sort of rock properties of kind of seismic velocities and Poisson's ratio, we can actually model the signal here of the static deformation. So this kind of is the basis for our detection algorithm. We can pick, this is a very clean signal, whereas those surface waves at higher frequencies were kind of fuzzy and propagated a lot further. This signal is very compact, and it allows us to do just simple trigger detection on this. So we form a short-term average over a long-term average, and we pick these signals. So every day, I basically did this STA-LTA, and I picked the 200 detections, just the 200 highest signal detections. And then I stacked them together. So the black traces in the background of the detections, and this red line is the kind of stack, the median, forming a template of the detections on this one day. Then I scan through and I find correlations. I scan that template through the full catalog for that position, and I pull out all of the matches. So this is a template matching kind of algorithm to then find all of the times when a vehicle with that same shape was detected at that location in the fiber. And that leads to something like this. So per day, we have then the number of cars passing that location of the road, in this case down here near Lower Sand Hill Road. And the pink line here, the magenta line, actually shows the kind of rolling median. And I'm plotting that against statistics provided by some tech companies. So Google and Apple provided mobility statistics based on cell phone tracking. And you can see that their numbers are presented as a change from background level in this area of the San Francisco Bay Area or Santa Clara, so a large regional area. And they do that because they have to anonymize their data sets, right? So they kind of protecting their privacy of their users, they provide these numbers in terms of a change in background. And the actual numbers that we're getting are actually a number of vehicles on the road. So interestingly, there's kind of a clear drop, right? During COVID, there's this clear reduction down to kind of 50% level from 11,000 cars to about 6,000 cars after the Bay Area shelter in place. And there's this little peak right here when it looks like people might have gone out to get supplies. This is on Sand Hill Road, which is kind of a busy corridor. But over here near Stanford Hospital, I actually have some friends work at Stanford Hospital, and they told me that basically the time actually at which they were told to kind of change patterns was about 2 weeks after the shelter in place. They were told to park in a different location of Stanford Hospital. And so I think that likely has to do with what this location right here, which is the kind of entrance to a parking lot, kind of has this deviation right then. But this kind of delayed reduction in vehicle drop is kind of an interesting, and allows us to basically look much more carefully within a city at the sources of this kind of sources of this traffic. So I hope it's kind of clear that the kind of power spectra that we're recording at any one location kind of covers this band between the higher frequency surface wave signals that I think dominate the observations that Tomas was talking about that's recorded typically in cities, and this kind of geodetic roadbed deformation at slightly longer periods. So we can actually connect these, right? So we can actually develop a model for how much strain per day, that is the surface wave strain in a given frequency band, is related to how many vehicles, because we actually count the cars, right? So we do a similar method to what Tomas was talking about by looking at in a certain band, basically aggregating the strain for that day. And then we form a model, and this linear relationship tells us that a certain amount of strain is injected into the seismic background of a city per vehicle. Now, these parameters likely don't hold, or they need to be kind of they need to be kind of considered. This is a kind of a preliminary first study. And so I think that other DAS arrays could provide us, or other seismic arrays could provide us a way of kind of looking across cities where different fibers are laid at different distances from the roads, and maybe in Europe there's different types of cars or different geology. And this would all impact this kind of the parameters of this model. But we need additional observations to kind of do that kind of comparison. So just to kind of summarize, we see this kind of 50% reduction with COVID-19 shelter in place, and traffic around the hospital changed much more slowly. And it's really only because we have this fiber optic cable in Palo Alto that we're able to do this kind of pinpoint locations that are of interest inside of a city and analyze the kind of sources as a per vehicle kind of addition to the seismic background. So I thank you very much for listening to me, but I also wanted to point you to, if you're interested, the kind of preprint, also additional tutorials and information on the web about DAS, this emerging method. We actually have an upcoming all virtual workshop with some colleagues that's going to be later in August. And if you're interested in kind of data processing, online kind of Jupyter Notebook interaction, to learn more about this type of data, you can go to this website and register. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nate. That was a really interesting talk about, in a way, repurposing the way that we conduct our seismology. And here you are in California, not studying earthquakes, but studying people in cars with seismometers. An interesting concept. We have some questions that are more general that will lead and will bring everyone back on board, but just specific to your talk. One of the people who has asked, how hard is it to get permission from fiber optic owners to tap into their fiber? What is the procedure for folks who are keen to get involved?
Yeah, that's a logistical question, right? And that's a really important logistical question, because you can't go out and just start recording on a fiber optic cable unless you can somehow connect to it. I would say that we got started, actually, my initial research got started by laying our own cable. So we were in a farm kind of deploying a cable in a trench kind of area. But to connect to a cable really requires interaction with the company, like, for example, CenturyLink or Level 3, and developing a partnership that allows you to do that takes time to kind of have them depend on you to not be able to just unplug a cable that is sending the financial trades to London. That's a very important risk that it kind of needs to be clarified, that geophysics can't operate in the same patch panel as these other kind of critical pieces of infrastructure. But currently we're using, universities have been a great way to kind of begin to access some of that fiber with fibers that kind of run around campuses or through national labs. So this is kind of a work in progress. But
so your suggestion is start locally on your campus, practice, and then move outward. Yeah, great. One of the earlier questions related to everyone, what majors did you graduate with and how important were they in your current career? Yours is an interesting one, and I think it would be great to hear from Susan and Thomas as well.
Yeah, I can go first. So I started out, that's a great question. I started out in optics, actually, and then kind of pivoted to an engineering major. I was at a university that allowed me to make my own major. So I basically just followed whatever I was interested in, and that took me into geophysics eventually, doing some undergraduate research. And I went on to get a degree in geophysics, but I kind of started out in engineering.
And Susan?
Yeah, I love this question because I think that many people in this field just follow completely different paths. So it's so great to hear about the sort of the variety of backgrounds that people have. For me, I was an undergraduate, a double major in biology and environmental science. And I was on a pre-med track and thought I was going to become a real doctor, a medical doctor, and had been working in hospitals and decided that, I was sort of seeing the same patients over and over again, and I thought that I could have more of an impact going a public health route. But I was very interested in the environmental science aspect of this, so I found a graduate degree in environmental science and engineering that was within a school of public health at UNC, at the University of North Carolina. And then that ended up taking me to this kind of combined environmental science and engineering and public health path that I'm in right now.
Really interesting. Tomas?
Yeah, by background, I'm a geologist, then moved to seismology during my PhD, learned the hard way geophysics, and then stayed in geophysics. And so I went through near surface geophysics and then moved to seismology, and then since probably 10 years now, more in the ambient noise and monitoring and environmental. So from volcanology seismology to environmental monitoring.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Another question or another way to link back all of your presentations, that we're looking at a link between pollution, whether it's noise pollution, air pollution, the pandemic, seeing the change, seeing the impact. That was an experiment all in itself. How do we move forward now? Understanding a little bit better about the system, having the public aware of these kinds of changes. Where do we go next? Susan, do you want to start? I got to be me. Yeah.
Sure. Someone has to go first. I think there's not only has this been an unprecedented experiment in the change in human behavior from a driving standpoint, but also from a science and policy standpoint, I would argue. I think Tomas talked about this really well in his presentation, talking about how scientists are now putting stuff out there more publicly and kind of creating communities where, maybe they were a little bit stuck in the last century before, where we kind of rely on physical presence at scientific conferences to bring us together. Now we create new ways to connect with each other and interact with each other. I would extend that beyond just scientists to scientists talking with the public and scientists talking with the media as well. I've seen some really nice work that people are doing, trying to make their science, kind of distill it for a more public audience. And so, I think hopefully, you asked the question of where do we go from here. I think hopefully that kind of turns over a new leaf and, we get into more of a cycle of being able to collaborate around the world. And, this is already being done, but less reliant on physical presence at conferences and more, interaction, from our home offices and more interaction with the public as well.
Great. Tomas, do you want to comment?
Yeah, sure. So I think also one important thing about this dramatic event that we have all hopefully lived through is that it's happening globally at the same time, everywhere, and it's not like a specific catastrophe occurring in a very densely populated place, and we are all affected because we all feel bad for them, but that's it. It's here, it's everywhere at the same time, roughly. Let's say March, April, May, June were basically the same effects everywhere. And so going into, for example, these lockdown measures was very, very drastic. So you have very sharp changes. And then phasing out is a different story. Different countries have different ways of going out of these lockdowns. And so for us, and that's the point we have also with people in Brussels working with satellite data, is that we have a very sharp change in the beginning, and then we can identify which elements during the phasing out have a stronger impact on the observables we are looking at. And so we have very much fine-grained information coming from there, and that's global also. So it's not only in Brussels City, but it's all around the world for different aspects. And I think this whole pandemic grouped people in a way that we are for example, today having a seminar that just basically links air pollution, seismic noise, and vehicle traffic. That is the beauty of it, and I think it's always good to have some beauty in those very dramatic moments.
Thank you. Nate, now your chance.
Yeah, sure. So I would say two things. I think I think the virtual aspect that I think you were talking about this earlier with Tomas, kind of the ability to kind of connect as such a giant group. I mean, there's 100 at one point, like 200 people on this webinar today. I think a lot of universities have started opening their the ability to share science is just kind of becoming easier and easier. And that really allows us to not just do that at the presentation mode, right at the end of science, but at the beginning and throughout the whole process. I mean, the kind of ongoing conversation that Tomas was kind of moderating in some ways, and in other ways, taking a back seat to during the whole project that he was involved with was kind of really interesting. And I think there's lots of different ways that could happen. I think the other thing I would say is kind of, I think Susan's work kind of shows it maybe best, but the kind of, this is a big experiment that we've just done in a lot of ways. And in terms of Earth system process, it's showing us that there is this marked change that we can observe, and it happens over just a few weeks. And that is kind of really easy to connect with the public on, to show that is that this system is dynamic and does kind of have inputs, and that those are human related. So those are really really helpful.
Yeah, and when part of this that Tomas was speaking about, many of the folks who were interacting were secondary school or even primary school teachers with Raspberry Pi seismometers in their classrooms. It's approachable science, and in a way that we've not had before. So I think there's a specific question for you. I'm looking at questions as they're popping up. They're primarily specific, but just in thinking again, going back, a second aspect of what all of you are doing is actually taking the kinds of algorithms and approaches and repurposing them or redirecting them to solve new problems. Susan, in particular, you're able to look at the public health aspects through the pollution and these correlations, but the potential for what you're doing, Nate, is clear as well. And Tomas, so in repurposing and rethinking the way that we write our programs and we share our software. Do you have any more comments?
Yeah, just on that note, I think that's a really great observation that we were able to take advantage of satellites that were already up there and were already observing the Earth system, and methods and algorithms that we have already been, developing over years to try to observe trends in air pollution levels and public health consequences. And I think what this shows is the importance of continued global monitoring of the Earth system. If we did not have these Earth system observations, we would not have anywhere near the knowledge that we have now, or the speed with which we were able to turn out information to the public, to the media, and to other scientists. So I just think it shows really the importance of environmental and public health surveillance in a continued fashion.
Thanks, Susan. And I think this really highlights some of the lessons here. We're a global community where global monitoring and global collaboration can really help us to achieve new insights and hopefully draw some good lessons from this and see this as an opportunity, as our speakers illustrated, to see how we can continue to do better science and improve the situation for communities worldwide. I would like to thank our speakers. I think this was an outstanding webinar, and it was really great to hear from the fantastic researchers who were presenting. And I also would like to thank our audience for providing and giving really great feedback, awesome questions, and our team at the National Academies. And I'd like to close it here, and all the material will be available online, so please check out these resources. And thanks again, everybody, for a great webinar.
Thank you.